We dive in with John Pearson today from our partner agency, Profound. Hi, John. Thanks for being here today with us.
Hi there. Hi, everybody.
We're excited to explore and find out more about the potential ROI behind making the switch to a MACH adoption. So with that, we'll hand it over to you.
Perfect. Okay. I think there's some slides that somebody has control of. If you can bring up the first few. Okay. That's great. So just a quick introduction. My name's John Pearson. I'm a director and co-founder here at Profound. We're an experience design agency based in the UK. We're also a Storyblock partner, and we focus on helping brands and businesses, both retail and B2B, to implement and successfully deploy MACH technologies. That's headless microservices systems. So that's just a brief kind of introduction. If we move to the next slide, just picking up on some of the things that Gillian was highlighting. One thing we've noticed over recent years is this dramatic shift in the way we all consume content these days. It's on multiple channels, it's on multiple devices. We see increasing use of things like, voice and wearables and kiosks and so forth. And this is cutting into a lot of different sectors. So if we go to the next slide, for instance, in the retail arena, where obviously the focus is very much B2C, we see increasing innovation with things like augmented reality and VR. Moving on to the next slide, in the area of B2B, we see manufacturers who are seeking better ways to provide experiences to their B2B clients, be that through specific apps or mobile apps or business portals. Moving on, we also see manufacturers going direct to consumer. So there's this proliferation of channels, this proliferation of devices, and that's the kind of backdrop that we as businesses, brands, and organizations are trying to address in terms of delivering a customer experience. But if you look at the way a lot of businesses, and the statistics held this up as shown a little bit earlier, the way things are moving currently, there's this trend to kind of cling on to the old monolithic world. And if we move to the next slide, I'll just touch a little bit on this. So what we see in the monolithic approach is a kind of historic or traditional view that if you have an all-in-one system, it's going to solve all my problems. And historically, that had its place, but what we see is a shift, moving away from this. But these all-in-one systems have their advantages in as much as potentially there's a lot in there, but they also have a lot of disadvantages, and they're really starting to come home, some of those challenges. The biggest one we see is that it is essentially a single slab of code base where you've got in one place your content, your page templates, your data, your business logic, and you've got the front end and the back end really tightly tied together. Now, if you're looking at this from a cost and an ROI perspective, if we move to the next slide, and you're starting to think about, well, if we change this approach, and we want to try to understand what could be the potential ROI of this change, you need to understand, first of all, what you're dealing with today in order to make the comparison. And in order to make that assessment, you've got to look at your monolithic world and think, well, what is that actually costing us in terms of the license approach? Is there a huge perpetual license that you're paying? What about upgrades? Typically, with these monolithic applications, you have an often not insignificant upgrade project. Not only is that often costly, particularly if you've got lots of customizations, it can also be very disruptive, it can take a long time, and it could delay a lot of your competitive advantage. You've then got the maintenance and hosting. Often you're looking after the infrastructure and trying to deal with all of that. You've got the cost of change over time. I'm going to come back to that point because it's very significant in just a moment. Often you're also typically working with a whole series of modules, but you're underusing a lot of them. We see this a lot, particularly in the CMS space, where clients have perhaps adopted a DXP, a digital experience platform, and the phrase we hear so often is, we're only using 10% of its capability. And often that's because a lot of modules were added in. They're probably suboptimal in terms of the core strength of that system, and so they tend to get underused. Well, that's a lot of wasted money in this context. You've then got the speed to market and the ability to experiment. Is that easy with these monolithic applications? How much design freedom do you have? Or actually, are you tied by the rigid page templates that you're working with? And are you suffering things like content freezes and delays while you're waiting for developers to do the things they need to do and get the QA through in order for you to actually do things on the front end? So you've then got to think about, well, how easy is it to launch into all these new channels that people are now adopting? And it was an interesting stat there about the number of CMSs, particularly their proliferation, because people just don't have trust. They feel they have to build something new for each particular channel. If we move on to the next slide, I just want to focus on the cost of change over time, because often if you are doing the maths, you really need to include that total cost of change. So if you think about the applications that you have in place today, think about over the years the time and cost that has been absorbed to do things like add new features, integrate a new application, fix bugs, add new releases, maybe making adjustments to the customer experience, or adding or amending customizations, or even trying to launch into a new channel. You've also got the cost of development and QA, managing dependencies. And often that's because you have a very tightly coupled technical architecture inside these monolithic applications. So if you make a change in one area, it has a knock-on effect on dependent functionality, which extends the development time, the testing time, and causes delay and disruption for business users when they're trying to get things out of the door. So these are all costs that you need to consider when you're making these assessments about bringing in new technologies. If we move to the next slide, just to highlight what MACH is for those who are not aware. So in essence, it's a technology approach that many technology vendors, exactly like Storyblock, have adopted these days. And it's essentially taking a microservices, API first, cloud native, headless approach. So that's what the MACH stands for. If we move on to the next slide, a picture always tells a tale far better in my view. So what does this look like in real life? Well, typically you will have a front end separated from a back end by an API layer, or that's your, if you like, a mediation layer or an integration layer through which data and content is orchestrated. What it means is, because you're separating that front end, you can really go to town on designing the perfect customer experience on multiple front ends, be that your website, your business portal, the mobile app, the kiosk, your chatbot, social channels, AR, VR, and so on and so on. So you can design that front end, and it won't be constrained by those back end components. And in the back end, you can compose an architecture that consists of best of breed applications. So that might be the CMS in perhaps Storyblock, or indeed it could be an e-commerce engine, a product information management system, a DAM, and so forth. So this separation of concerns is really vital to understand, because it has a lot of benefit and brings a lot of advantage to the way you do things. If we move on to the next slide, one of the advantages, just thinking about launching into new channels. So if you remain with that monolith approach, you often have to build an entire application just to enter a specific channel. So you need to build something unique for your mobile app or unique for that business portal. And that becomes a real overhead in the business. If you go the MACH route, you just simply adapt the back-end components that you have to suit the front end. So you have that central control, but the freedom to render and display content and or transactions, or whatever it is you need to do at the front end through that API layer. Another dimension, if you're looking at the overall costs of bringing in this type of approach, is your ways of working. So if we move to the next slide, people, when they're deploying these types of systems or any kind of application in the business, will tend to work in one of two ways: either big bang, so you do a lot of upfront discovery, requirements gathering, and specification, and then you go into a dark hole for 6 or 8 months doing design and build, and at the far end you do some testing and then you launch. The other route, which is often more attractive and we see more commonly deployed, is working in an agile way. So you will quickly do some discovery and perhaps a proof of concept, and then move into an iterative approach of sprints where you're delivering value a lot earlier in the process. And if that's your preferred way of working, you can actually adapt the advantages that MACH technologies bring by gracefully strangling out some of the components in your existing architecture and decompose the things that you no longer need and replace it with best of breed components, like, for instance, the CMS or a DAM or a PIM or whatever it might be. So another dimension to this, if we move to the next slide, is that early start of that process. So if you do work in that agile way, you can actually remove quite a lot of cost in the RFP process. We see organizations all the time invest huge amounts and a large amount of time and effort and money simply creating an RFP, all the requirements, documentation, and so on and so forth. You can often get started an awful lot quicker by rapidly working up some discovery, focus on the customer experience and some user stories, create a proof of concept, and work with some of these MACH technologies, and you're off to a flyer because you're very quickly delivering value much earlier. So you can remove that cost and see value a lot earlier, working in an agile way and working with these MACH technologies. So it's just something to consider in the mix in the context of the overall costs and your ways of working. If we move to the next slide, where does the overall upside come when you're working with MACH technologies? Well, we see it broadly in two areas: efficiency and growth. So in terms of efficiency, the thing that's removed immediately is upgrade projects. And that's not to be underestimated because these can be hugely expensive. As I touched on earlier, if you're working in this model, you're working with vendors who are providing releases either daily or weekly. So the whole notion of an upgrade project just disappears. You also move to a subscription licensing model, which can be a lot more attractive than the perpetual license model, which is often good news for your CFO. You're also shifting a lot of the responsibility to the vendors because the vendors are providing the hosting and a lot of the headaches that go with that. You're also moving to a code agnostic development scenario. So it doesn't matter what code language you're using on the front end, it can be different to the back end. And what that also means is that you don't necessarily have to find those unique, often very expensive unicorn type developers who are deep specialists in a particular application. In our experience, if you have a good set of front-end developers or full-stack developers who understand working with APIs, you can go an awful long way to put in place a really solid MACH solution. It also creates less low-value maintenance, so you're not doing low-value tasks, managing all the infrastructure, and your development gets a lot faster. In terms of growth, that means you can get to market a lot quicker. You've also got the create once, publish anywhere notion, and that's hugely valuable, not just in the context of, say, content and feeding it out to websites, but also things like being more innovative, perhaps with your e-commerce. Maybe you want to embrace conversational commerce or surface your checkout in areas of high buying intent, maybe in social channels or through WhatsApp and all that sort of thing. You can facilitate that far more easily by having a solid MACH architecture as your back-end capability feeding into those front ends. And with that front end, you are unconstrained. So you're not going to be held back by page templates constraining you in any way. You can carry on and do the front end piece in a really solid way and service that customer experience in the right way. It gives you more time to innovate, which means you get more motivated staff, and you're future-proofing that experience design piece at the front end. We as a business were very motivated by MACH and the architecture it brings, not so much because it's an exciting technology, but actually for what it facilitates. And what it facilitates is a separated front end that is not constrained by those back-end systems. And that means you can genuinely invest in understanding the customer journey, the pain points, the motivators, and then designing a UX that's very attractive and compelling to increase conversion with the audience that you're trying to reach. So if you take it from that perspective, a MACH architecture just makes huge sense for better addressing customer experience needs. If we move on to the next slide, we've got a few pointers here just for the way we help clients think about not just the ROI, but the whole process of adopting a MACH approach. And we like to think of these 7 points, and that's starting with the strategic goals that you're thinking about, the customer experience you want to create, your business user experience. And one thing Storyblock is fantastic at is delivering that business user experience. Your future state technology architecture, what does it need to look like? Who will be implementing the platform? Do you want to do it yourselves? Do you want to work with a partner? Do you want to do it as an augmented team? What's the best way to do that? How will you be rolling out the new platform? Will you be doing it in a big bang approach, or do you want to take that slightly more steady as she goes, strangled out approach? There's a number of ways to do it. And then think about the budget that you're able to apply to that, taking into account all of the costs of your current systems and so on. And then finally, just to wrap up, as a business, we like to help people along this journey wherever we can. So on the next slide, you'll see we've got a number of things that we can provide to help. We've got an ebook on adopting the right CMS platform. We've got a free Headless bootcamp, which expands it out to not just the CMS, but thinking about your whole architecture. That's a unique offer for people attending this session. So do get in touch with the team and it'll feed through to us, and we're happy to have a conversation. Or if you just need some help thinking about your wider technology selection across the whole MACH architecture, we can help out in that context. But hopefully that's given you a few pointers about the adoption of MACH technologies, what we see in the marketplace in terms of its usage, but of the costs and perspectives associated with that. So hopefully that's helpful, and I'll hand back to the team.